through cold winters and rainy nights, and who organized a remarkable and courageous campaign to win respect and fair pay and decent working conditions. But I am really very angry this morning. As the lead sponsor of Local Law 115 of 2021, which required the Adams administration to implement minimum pay for delivery workers by January 1st of this year, I'm angry about the months-long delay in implementation, which violates the law and which forces delivery workers to wait at least 5 months and perhaps more for their long overdue pay raise. By this delay, let's be clear, the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, which is supposed to protect low-wage workers, is essentially stealing from them. Who made billions of dollars in profits during the pandemic in order to protect their business model of profiting off the backs of their workers. It's appalling, and it should not be allowed to stand. Let's just go through the timeline and the details briefly, and then I'll be honored to introduce the folks standing here today. So Local Law 115 of 2021, which I was honored to be the prime sponsor for, but let's be clear, came because of a remarkable campaign of organizing by thousands of Deliveristas who organized through the pandemic, who organized an extraordinary march from Times Square to City Hall, who on the day of our hearing on this law had an amazing ride around City Hall. We passed that law which required DCWP to study working conditions of delivery workers, do a study modeled on what had already happened, let's remember, for Uber and Lyft drivers. New York City had become the first city in the country to do a thorough study and require minimum pay for what's a very similar model of work, app-based, trip-based work, and then promulgate rules establishing minimum per trips payments, minimum payment standards by January 1st, 2023. And then DCWP staff actually worked hard to research and calculate a minimum pay rate in an effort to fulfill the requirements of the legislation and the worker-led campaign that prompted it. And DCWP proposed rules last fall, which largely complied with the law. But then, lo and behold, after the first round of rules were promulgated, and after an intense campaign of lobbying by DoorDash, Grubhub, and Uber, including, and we'll talk about this a little more, an aggressive campaign to inspire fear in their workers by threatening them rather than supporting this law, DCWP issued a second revised set of rules in March 2023, already 2 months after the deadline for the law to go into effect, which substantially reduced the pay formula by more than $3 an hour, and which results in a sub-minimum base wage. And to break it down a little bit, DCWP attempts to present the hourly wage for workers after expenses as $19.96 an hour. But let's be clear, after reductions for the entirely fabricated concept of multi-apping, a concept which does not appear in the DCWP report, a concept which no one ever introduced until after the initial rule was promulgated, and the needless phase-in, granted without phase-in. Like, what is that? You're paying a minimum wage, you're a multi-billion-dollar company, you get 2 more years to pay a minimum wage after 4 years of not paying it. After those reductions, and after deductions of expenses, taxes, paid time off, and workers' compensation, we calculate that the average base wage for 2023 would actually be $12.69, even if you worked the full hour and responded to every trip the apps gave you during that time. And let's remember that even $12.69 isn't really $12.69. $15 was the minimum wage that was set in 2019, but inflation has substantially eroded that. The purchasing power of that $12.69 in 2019 dollars is about $10 an hour. That is the base minimum wage that this revised rule would implement. So first, that $3.60 pay reduction for the fabricated concept of multi-apping should be eliminated in its entirety. It's not supported by DCWP's research. Like for-hire drivers, like Uber and Lyft drivers, many delivery workers spend their on-call time, their waiting time, with a couple of apps open to see where they'll get their trip next. But there's never a time when 2 companies are paying them. And so just like with the for-hire vehicle driver rule, The utilization rate that a company pays while you're on a trip has to reflect the average wait time a worker has, or else workers are not being paid for the full time they're working. It's really simple, and made up regulatory doublespeak in response to corporate lobbying is designed to obscure the facts, but it doesn't change the fact that workers need to be fairly compensated for their wait time through an appropriate utilization rate applied to their trips, just like Uber and Lyft drivers in New York City are. This revised rule fails to do that. And then second, this concept of the phase-in is just insulting to New Yorkers and really insulting to delivery workers. New York set a minimum wage of $15 an hour in 2019. You don't have to check your calendars to know it's 2023. It's 4 years later. And yet what this rule says is poor DoorDash and Grubhub and Uber, this will be tough for them to pay a minimum wage to their workers, despite the fact that they profited to the tune of billions of dollars during the pandemic. Let's not rush to implement it. We'll give them 2 more years just to get to the minimum wage. It is gross, it is appalling, and it should not be allowed to stand. So we are pleading with DCWP and City Hall. Do not capitulate to corporate lobbying. Do not allow DoorDash, Grubhub, and Uber to continue to profit by paying sub-minimum wages to their workers. It's a violation of the law, and it's a violation of what's right. We can speak in response to questions about some of the propaganda that the companies are feeding workers over the app through which they employ and pay them, and why that is so scary, but also why it is total BS. But it really is this simple. DCWP must guarantee that workers are paid at least the $15 minimum wage for every hour they work, after expenses, including the time they spend waiting for their next trip. That is what the law requires them to do. That's what DCWP proposed last fall, and it is what they must do in their final rule. To help further make that case and talk about why it's important, we have just a really fantastic coalition. There were 25 council members and elected officials who signed on to the letter that outlines what we're here for today, and we have a great set of them. And we're going to alternate between workers and their representatives and elected officials, because this really was and has been a worker-led campaign. So to kick us off, we're going to start with Gustavo Ache from Worker Justice Project, who has been fighting so hard for himself and his colleagues.
Okay. Buenos días, mi nombre es Gustavo Ache, soy repartidor en la ciudad de Nueva York y fundador de los Deliveristas Unidos. Gracias por hacer esta conferencia de prensa al controlador Brad Lander por apoyarnos. Y pues nada, en lo personal sigo acá en la lucha desde que empecé en el 2020. Tuve una mala experiencia en plena Navidad, me accidenté y lastimosamente estuve 15 días en casa. Y después de eso me fui dando cuenta que muchos de los trabajadores sufren lo mismo y hasta peores condiciones. Se quedan en casa 6 meses, 7 meses sin ni un ingreso y las aplicaciones no responden a nada de esto. Entonces vimos a la necesidad de presionar para que se dé un salario digno, para que el trabajador sea respetado como es, ya que durante la pandemia tuvimos un rol esencial en toda la ciudad. Nos dijeron que éramos ya esenciales, pero el trato no era así.
So, good morning. My name is Gustavo Ache, and I'm the founder of Los Deliveristas Unidos. Thank you for the Comptroller, Brad Lander, for holding this press conference and rally. And I just wanted to share a little bit about me. I'm still here fighting for this, but let me share a little bit of the story. In December of 2020, I actually was working with these apps, and I got actually into an accident. And what happened is that I had to stay home without a pay. And this is what happens to many other deliveristas. The apps don't really care about us. And this is why it took us to really get to this moment to really fight for a living wage.
Como repartidores paseamos en toda la ciudad bajo la lluvia, bajo la nieve y arriesgamos nuestra vida para llevar la comida caliente, y durante el encierro del coronavirus siempre estuvimos trabajando, y creo que es justo que nos traten como esenciales, como nos lo han dicho, y siempre estamos trabajando y haciendo lo mejor para que la ciudad siga saliendo a flote, ya que si no fuese por nuestra labor, por nuestro trabajo, muchos de los restaurantes o muchos pequeños negocios no hubiesen sobrevivido a la pandemia. Entonces, durante la pandemia nosotros ayudamos a la ciudad a salir a flote. Ahora creo yo que es justo que la ciudad también haga algo ya por nosotros, y que no se dejen de llevar ya de la mala información que las aplicaciones se están tratando de llevar hacia el consumidor y el trabajador. Esperamos que sea esta nuestra última audiencia y que la próxima vez estemos ya en alguna otra conferencia de prensa, pero ya celebrando los números y la implementación del salario mínimo.
Yeah. So I just wanted to share that as delivery workers or deliveristas, we ride with our bikes throughout the city, through rain, snow, risking our lives in order to deliver the food, warm food, to across the city. And, you know, we do this just with the hope to get good tips. And it's been 2 years already that we actually already won the minimum pay. And he mentioned something, and this was something personal that wasn't written. He mentioned that it was really that the labor of Deliveristas who really supported the entire city and allowed many restaurants to stay opened. And I strongly feel that now it is time for the city to support us. It is the time to make sure that it is delivered. And we're hoping that this is the last hearing. That next time we're gathering here is to really be having conversations about the final pay and how the implementation is going to be happening.
Pues le pedimos al alcalde Adams que ya no se deje llevar por la mala información que están llevándole las compañías, y creemos que en Nueva York somos diferentes. No creo que no estamos en Seattle, no estamos en San Francisco, donde las aplicaciones hicieron lo que ellos quisieron hacer, bloquearon a los trabajadores de poder organizarse, de poder luchar por mejores derechos. En Nueva York somos la fuerza laboral y la clase trabajadora tenemos la voz acá también.
So one of my asks to the Mayor Adams is not to be misled by these apps. And I want to let the apps know that we're not in Seattle, we're not in California, this is New York City. This is where worker power is at, and we're going to be fighting for better working conditions.
Pues gracias a todos los que están presentes acá día, los aliados y los electos también que están apoyándonos, y nada, nuestra lucha sigue.
So thank you to our allies, electeds, and just want to let you know that the fight continues.
All right. One thing that Gustavo's story reminds me of, I think it's just worth noting here, is that even with this rule, delivery workers will not get paid health insurance, which I'm fortunate to have, and most of you have. I need it when I'm sick, and sometimes you have an accident, and you need it when you're sick. And delivery workers will not have unemployment insurance, so that if they are injured and they're waiting, and they don't have that period of unemployment insurance. So we're just talking about the minimum wage here, and that is what the apps are pushing back to even pay. We've got two great elected officials who are here this morning, 25 more who signed on to the letter. Our public advocate, Jumani Williams, and I have done a lot of press conferences before, but I don't think we've yet done one inside the municipal building. So I'm glad that this is our first one inside, so we're going to hear from our public advocate, Jumani Williams, a fierce fighter for workers. And then after that, we have the chair of the City Council's Committee on the Consumer and Worker Protection, Marjorie Velasquez, another just great friend, both of mine and of delivery workers. So, public advocate.
Thank you. Peace, everybody. Peace and blessing, love and light. Our inaugural joint municipal press conference. I think just as a society in general, we have grown used to a system where we gain things from workers and then continue to allow them to be exploited. And sometimes that's unwittingly, I think it's set up that way. But, as was mentioned, these delivery workers really allowed the city to keep moving during the pandemic, really allowed restaurants to remain open, and it allowed us to get our food as immediately as we wanted it, whether it was cold, whether it was raining, whether there was COVID outside and you didn't want to go outside. They were outside making sure you got your food, and they're doing the same today. And sometimes we tend to dismiss who they are, what they are, their families, and their needs, and the system is set up that way. My office put out a gig report maybe roughly a year ago to show how badly the gig work in particular is ripe for exploitation. Very often there are immigrant communities, they are not English as first language communities, and the exploitation is ripe right there. And what we've seen is the Grubhubs, the DoorDashes, and the Ubers using this gig work to exploit, and basically stealing, at this point, wages. What I generally hope not to see is that government is an accomplice in that theft. And we are at that point where government now is an accomplice to that theft. Thankfully, because of the work of the advocates, the delivery workers themselves, the Comptroller, the chair, parts of government stepped in and said, we're going to do the right thing and make sure you get paid some kind of value to what it is you're actually doing for the entire city. I want people to think, what would happen if you had to get out and get your own food? What is that worth? It's worth something. It really is, and it really kept us going. And we just said, simply pay them an honorable wage, a minimum wage. And the people who make billions of dollars, they're not crying, they're not complaining because they're not making money, because they are making a lot of money, are putting pressure so they can make every single dollar they can at the expense of folks who are simply trying to stay in their homes, who when they get injured, as was mentioned, have no health care. And if they don't work, they don't get paid. This is not something we're saying these folks are getting rich. This is just to live a life that we want to live, be able to pay rent and be able to eat. And to do that, you have to get some kind of wage minimally to survive. And so to have DCWP step in and say, we're not even going to do that, to have an administration say, we're going to capitulate to the billionaires who are benefiting from this exploitative system, I actually don't think New Yorkers would support that. I think if New Yorkers understood what was going on every single day, with the people they actually may get to know because they are frequently, what's happening to their lives, because our government is working with billionaires to keep money out of their pockets, I don't think they would support that. And this is a dangerous job, as mentioned. Unfortunately, sometimes you have unscrupulous New Yorkers who want to steal from you. We have New Yorkers who don't know how to drive and hit you. And we have workers who have died. This is so reasonable. Like, the more reasonable the thing, the angrier I get. And the fact that we stepped in and did the right thing, and you're still forcing folks to wait for their money. They are working hard for this. They deserve it. They are providing the service. And by the way, it's the law. You're breaking the law, and you are accomplice to theft is what's happening right now. So please, today, just follow the law. Thank you.
I always have to adjust for the height, so thank you all for that. Give me 2 seconds so I can pull up my notes because I'm at that point, y'all. My brain can't retain. Good morning.
Good morning.
And today is a good day to do good. It is Good Friday. For so many of us, we talk about the sacrifices and what that meant. It also talks about being together with our families and taking care of our families. This is New York City, y'all. Everyone's our family. We take care of our own, and we're not doing that. The Deliveristas were out there in the streets when it was the hardest part for us. They did it for us. They maintained us, fed us. We need to do the same. We need to make sure that we're giving protections. And yes, today we are just talking about a minimum pay. But there's still clearly much more work that we need to do. It is a union town, so I'm so proud to see 32 BJ here. We need to understand what that means. It means protection. But we could do something about it today. What we're asking for is just a minimum pay. It is the dignity and the respect of our workers when it was the hardest for us. So when we're talking about frontline workers, you're seeing them right here. And it's the respect and the dignity that they deserve. So I am the chair of Consumer Worker Protection. So my priority is also to protect our workers who are out there and making sure that they have everything available to them. So this is just the first step, and I look forward to working harder to protect you all. But more importantly, let's take care of each other. And right now, today, if you're ordering from the apps, this is a very, very holy week for so many of us. Take the time out and tip well. That's your responsibility as a consumer. Make sure that you're respecting the fact that these folks are not with their family this weekend because they have no other choice. This is their job. This is their lifeline. So just make sure that you're tipping well. As a New Yorker, that is your responsibility. So now in Spanish. Bueno, hoy estamos aquí en Viernes Santo y nosotros sabemos que ese día es muy especial para muchas de nuestras familias. Lo que indica es que los sacrificios que nosotros hemos tenido también tienen una cosa en común. Es para proteger nuestra familia. Y aquí en Nueva York, todos somos una familia bien grande. Y nosotros tenemos que entonces proteger nuestros deliveristas, que estaban aquí con nosotros en los momentos más difíciles, estaban en las calles, trabajando para nosotros, manteniéndonos, dando comida. Y nosotros tenemos que entonces darle el respeto y la dignidad de este pago mínimo. Pero eso no es todo. Nosotros también tenemos que protegerlo. Nosotros aquí en Nueva York somos un grupo que tenemos las uniones que nos protege. Y esas protecciones deben estar aquí. Y por eso que agradezco al 32BJ que están aquí con nosotros para proteger nuestros deliveristas. Pero lo más importante es, hoy es solamente el pago mínimo. Lo que entonces vamos a trabajar es para protecciones más para nuestros deliveristas, porque somos una familia. Entonces, para todos los neoyorquinos que están aquí esta semana, este fin de semana, entienden que este fin de semana, que muchas de las religiones están observando. Tenga la oportunidad de que cuando entonces están pidiendo los deliveristas que le den propina, que de verdaderamente cambia la vida de ellos, porque ellos están aquí trabajando para ustedes. Entonces, muchísimas gracias. Mi nombre es Marjorie y soy el chair de Consumer Worker Protection. Gracias.
Thank you to our great elected official allies and supporters. To close us out, we're going to hear from two leaders of worker organizing. First, from Ligia Gualpa, the executive director of the Worker Justice Project, who's been working hard in partnership with Deliveristas for years to help win recognition and dignity and pay. And then to close us out, we're going to hear from Israel Melendez from SEIU 32BJ. 32BJ, in addition to doing a great job of organizing its members of building service workers, has been there so many times for other New Yorkers who didn't have a union, but who needed to have worker organizing at their backs, showed up for fast food workers, showed up for for-hire vehicle drivers. So it is no surprise that they are showing up for Deliveristas as well, and we're really grateful that they're in this fight along with us. Ligia.
Thank you. Yeah. So, well, first of all, thank you, Comptroller, for having us here and to continue to fight, which is very unfortunate because we should be celebrating a victory that was won 2 years ago. And I just wanted to share a little history of how we got to this moment, that
And actually, my name is Ligia Walp. I'm the Executive Director of Workers' Justice Project. And when the pandemic hit, a lot of workers became unemployed because a lot of restaurants were closing, a lot of the shops and critical essential jobs that people were doing did not exist anymore. And a lot of workers actually turned into app delivery work as the only way to survive through the pandemic. And when that happened, Workers' Justice Project was also became a resource hub to make sure workers were connected not only with economic aid, we're having everything that they need to get through the pandemic. And it was through that chapter of the organization that, along with Gustavo, as we connected with more workers, we started realizing that in New York City, one of the most wealthiest cities of the country, we had essential workers, Deliveristas, doing the most essential work to be able to keep every New Yorker safe without pay, only relying on the tips of the consumer. And when that came across, that's completely unacceptable. That in a wealthy city, we have essential workers doing a job without pay and taking all the risks just to get us through. And because it was unacceptable, we partnered with elected officials, especially with Brad Lander, electeds that are still here with Jumani, to say that's unacceptable, and this is why we passed the minimum pay. Because Deliveristas were not getting a wage and were not getting compensated and valued fairly for their labor. And since then, we were supposed to be here celebrating the minimum pay. And guess what? We're not. Unfortunately, the Adams administration has failed to meet the deadline to enact the minimum pay law. So unfortunately, we find ourselves yet in another public hearing where workers now have to justify again as why they need a minimum pay. They have to justify why, again, their labor is so valuable to the city. And they have to justify again how these companies are exploiting them to the point that in Good Friday, many of them are struggling to bring food to their own homes while they're delivering food to other families. So by delaying this process, as it has been said, is showing that he's willing to bend the rules for big corporations who are making billions of dollars and are denying to pay workers a minimum pay. And the reason I want to say minimum pay is because we're just setting up the basic standards for industry where it doesn't exist. And once again, big apps are doing what they do best, which is confuse, mislead, not only consumers, not only restaurants, but also workers, using fear as a way to stop the enactment of the ability of workers having a pay. And what we want to do right now is to urge the administration, urge consumers, urge every New Yorker to say that this is unacceptable, that we can no longer go with another 2 months more without ensuring that a delivery worker gets a livable wage. We're going to keep fighting. I know that Deliveristas are going to be testifying, and we know exactly what the apps are going to be doing, which is playing against each other, creating a false narrative around the idea that Deliveristas, essential workers, do not deserve a livable wage. And we're not going to take that, and we're not going to accept it, and we're going to push back, and we're going to organize, and we're proud to keep doing this organizing and fighting back the power of corporations with bold elected officials who are not afraid to say that that's unacceptable, and that's not going to happen in our city. Thank you, Comptroller Brad Lander, Jumani, Councilmember Marjorie, and also unions who are willing to fight along with ununionized workers. Thank you, 32BJ, for always having our back.
Let's put this up. I'm a little taller than some of the people that spoke. So again, my name is Israel Melendez. I'm a vice president here at 32BJ. And like the city delivery workers, you guys were all essential workers, just like the 180,000 members that we've had. We were essential workers. I'm proud to be here to speak from 32BJ's point of view, how we support you. We're behind you 100%. You guys brought the city back. You helped bring the city back. And the more I heard Jumani, Brad, and I heard Marjorie speak, and some of the other advocates, it's just the right thing to do. It's just the right thing to do. This is not a complicated issue. We want the DCWP to stand strong against these corporate entities like DoorDash, Grubhub, and Uber Eats. Again, these members are mostly from immigrant backgrounds and deserve to have basic rights to work, basic rights to be able to survive in the city, and they work long hours. We've heard stories from members that have gotten hurt. Deliveristas have gotten hurt on the job and had to stay without pay, which is something in a city this big and a city this powerful shouldn't happen. We want the DCWP to recognize the abusive conditions of this industry, the essential role that these delivery workers play, and to be able to do the right thing and make sure all we ask is for a wage that has not been set in this industry. So again, with 32BJ behind you, we all, not just Deliveristas, all workers in this city, all workers deserve to have a decent job, decent wage, should be able to be proud of what they do and be able to survive in this city. And we're going to stand behind you guys 100% as long as it takes. I want to thank Comptroller Brad Landers, Councilmember Marjorie Velasquez, and also Public Advocate Jumani Williams for their endless support of the working people of this city. And again, we're stand behind you 100%. Thank you so much for your dedication.
Thank you very much, Israel. It really is tremendous to have 32BJ be there for other workers to help support them and their organizing. We see it and we're grateful for it. Just one point and then we'll take some questions. I've seen over the last couple of days on social media a few screenshots of what the apps are saying to their workers. And, it's a long history of corporations finding different ways to union bust, right? There's the classic captive audience meeting where a boss gets workers together, like Starbucks is doing, but this goes way back. It's new, though, for workers to have their job be through their app so that they get their pay literally through the app, and to then use that very app to just feed propaganda that makes you afraid that a law that's going to help you would hurt you is really insipid. And let's just remember this is exactly what Uber and Lyft did in the face of the very comparable for-hire vehicle minimum pay law. They said workers would lose flexibility. They said it would disrupt their model. They sued to block it. But New York City implemented it anyway, and what happened? Workers saw several $1,000s more in their pockets and went from poverty wages to still being low-wage workers, but at least, as Jumani said, being able to pay the rent and pay the bills. And how are the rides for New Yorkers affected? Very, very minimally. Companies had a new incentive to reduce the wait times. And so that's actually mostly what they did was increase their utilization rates. Wait times and fees for higher rides went up very minimally. There was a whole study on this about how well it worked. So this canard that it will hurt workers is just nothing more than them using the corporate power that they have to impose fear on their workers, to lobby elected officials in order to roll back something that would be good for workers and just fine for their business model. We shouldn't stand for it. We'll take some questions. Yeah.
For the workers, how concerned are you that the app companies might try to restrict access to the app or reduce your hours if they have to pay you more? And also, how possible is it for you to work for a restaurant directly? Like, do you absolutely need these apps, to get jobs?
Javier, is she going to answer your question?
Hi, my name's Josh. I'm a longtime worker on these apps. My experience with these apps is that the flexibility that they promise to us is largely a myth anyway. as it stands right now, you can't just open up these apps, create a fresh account, and immediately be signing on to the best slots. You can't decline orders that they give you and then still expect to get new orders at the end of the day. We are, with a couple of exceptions, pretty much beholden to working on the schedule that they choose to give us and doing the routes that they choose to give us, like any other employee would. So when they say that we are going to be reducing your flexibility as a result of these changes, I have seen that over the years, they have been reducing our flexibility anyway. And any change that they plan to make and blame it on these changes is something that they were going to do anyway, and they're just going to use this as an excuse.
And I just really do want to underline, looking at the Uber and Lyft, they just said exactly the same thing. It was basically the exact same minimum pay model, right? You can still multi-app to wait for trips, but we're going to factor the wait time into what you have to be paid per trip if you're using that model. They really, so comparable in the model. They said the exact same thing, but we ran the experiment and it worked. And so for them just to lie again is not surprising, but Katie.
For Comptroller and Public Advocate and the council members who are here.
Thanks, Marge.
I wanted to get your take on, I know there has been a movement, there are some delivery workers who are opposed to this. They've been rallying, they were rallying at City Hall last week. They've been attacking the workers just as, attacking that movement. I just wanted to get your take on it, because it's been a significant number of delivery workers doing it, so if anyone wants to just chime in on that.
I'll start. We've been joined by Councilmember Gail Brewer.
Anything to answer that question?
Yes. No, I just am welcoming you, and you are welcome to have a minute at the podium if you like, and then both the public advocate and WJP and worker reps. One thing I'll say is, we saw this also in the Uber and Lyft battle, right? There were actually, at that time, kind of competing worker organizations. You had New York Taxi Workers Alliance, and you had Independent Drivers Guild, and they did not have any love for each other. But they organized, in ways that helped push forward worker rights, and it resulted in a big pay raise. I would just say from my personal experience, having marched with the WJP and the Deliveristas from Times Square and down to City Hall and gone out to a lot of rallies, this is hard. It's hard work to begin with. It's a really hard organizing to do. They don't have the structure of a labor union in which dues provide resources to get out and be able to have one-on-one conversations with workers. So I just don't think it's surprising that if the apps work really hard. They just have so much more access to every single worker. And if the thing you look at every day to get your job and your trips and your pay is now telling you you're at risk of it, it's totally understandable that you would be anxious about it. It's a very effective model for stoking fear. And then I guess if you hear that the organization that's been fighting hard to win the pay gets some grants from philanthropic organizations in order to support their organizing, you think, oh, where'd those grants come from and how come I'm not getting them? This is not a hard way. It's easy to understand why fear has been stoked. And of course, workers are concerned, will I be able to open this app and get my trips and get paid for my work? And if the very app itself is telling you you're at risk of that and pointing somewhere else, I think it's not hard to understand why those anxieties could be exploited. But I would just urge people to kind of put that aside for a minute, because the question on the table today for this hearing is not, do they have the best model of organizing? Should it be a labor union? Should it be an independent guild? How many should there be? Should we recognize multiple worker organizations? All really interesting questions, and actually I think the questions about who should be able to represent workers and how are fascinating. But the question on the table today is, should the law that the city passed be implemented by rule to pay workers a minimum wage? And distracting by, I'm not saying you're doing this, but there's an effort to kind of distract from that question by talking about, potential disagreements within the organizing model. And that is just one more tool that exploitative employers use to, to promote dissension amongst their workers rather than focusing on paying a living wage.
I was going to say, one, I think the workers you're speaking about, their experiences and their work and their thoughts are valuable, and are welcomed, in my opinion, and we have to make sure everyone's voice is heard and valued as much as everyone else's. I will say in 2023, I think we've seen how easy it is to exploit the very real fears of people in a way that actually harm the very folks that they're exploiting. So I want to make sure that I mention that. And to be clear, what we see in these big apps is any kind of union busting or any kind of situation like this is they want to make as much money as possible, and so anything that challenges that, they do their best to break up. And it's painful because it's not even like we're just saying you don't get to make any money. You just don't get to make all the money on the backs of the people who are actually taking all the risks. But what seems to happen in all those cases, they will pump and push misinformation, disinformation, and an ability to exploit the fears that are real and exist. And the people sometimes who have the most to lose in the best situations, look, you're not going to have work. You're not going to be able to pay your bills. These people are trying to harm you. Those are the types of things we see over and over again every time this steps up and comes up, and that ugliness raises its head. So I'm actually, as a comptroller, not surprised that this is going on. But I do think, as he mentioned, the main focus here is that there was a law passed for people to get a minimum wage. That law is not being followed. Someone's wage is being stolen, and government is now an accomplice to that.
Yeah, and I wanted to share exactly what's going on. I'm going to tell you, right now, the apps are changing their business model. And what workers, instead of seeing a minimum pay that they should have already seen, what they're seeing is massive deactivations. They're seeing a less number of deliveries because there is a much greater workforce. What they're seeing is payment retentions. And then what being told is that because of the organizing, they have to, they're forced into these problems. And once again, what the apps are creating is not only fear, frustration, confusion, but what they really want right now is their big fight is use that fear, that confusion to make sure that they pay as little as possible. And we're not surprised that workers who depend on this job are seeing massive deactivations, workers who are seeing their payments retained, who are being told that they'll be locked out of their app if they get a minimum pay. We're not surprised that workers will fear because they depend on the ability to work on the apps. But this is what the fight is about. This is about ensuring that we hold these corporations accountable. We make them pay a livable wage that they actually are now responsible to pay before we pass this law. So this is what the fight is about. And, you know, unfortunately, workers are misplacing their frustration on the organizer and the organization rather than the companies, because the companies are misleading, are telling that they have to change their business model. They have to exploit workers. They have to deactivate workers because they're organizing to secure minimum pay. That's the real story. And that's why they're willing to do it publicly, not only tell this to Workers 101, but they're willing to publicize it also on their emails that they're sending to workers. They're literally, Uber, Grubhub, DoorDash are sending emails saying, go against your minimum pay because this is going to put you out of work. Go against minimum pay because this is going to take away your flexibility. Go against your minimum pay because this might mean that there's less jobs for you. That is not true. What the companies don't want them to know is that there's going to be a significant increase in their pay. What these companies don't want them to know is that it's going to force them to be more responsible and actually not only more transparent with them. Instead of having a worker wait 12 hours to get 2 deliveries, it's going to force them to be honest and say, you know what, I have these hours and I'm going to make sure you pay a livable wage. And this is what these companies have done, not only in New York, have done it in every city where workers are organizing and trying to push back. And we're going to fight back. Worker leaders have mobilized 500 workers to actually educate them and actually make sure that the workers really understand that these are false lies. And they're not going to,
they're not going to back down. They're going to fight. It's a law. As Gustavo has said it, it's a law. We cannot go back. What the fight is right now, what we're fighting is how much they have to pay. And what we're asking is the basic. Is the basic for workers who until now do not have a wage. That's the real problem.
Comptroller, obviously this came as a result of a study and a formula that came up with the wage. Outside of the pushback from the app-based companies during the public comment period, have you gotten any communication from DCWP or City Hall as to why they made this change or pointed to some change outside of the pushback?
I have not. I mean, I learned of the revised rule, you know, the day that they, or maybe the day before they announced it. They did not provide any new information. They did not update their study. I mean, they put out the document that goes through the feedback that they got. But you should, I mean, you could see that document. The document was like, workers said, yes, they would like minimum pay. The app said, no, they would like not to pay minimum pay. I mean, there was some really revealing quotes from the apps in that document in which they basically said, we don't think we should have to pay the minimum wage for this work. You know, again, that's just right out there when we say that this appears to be the administration capitulating to corporate lobbying. You know, they don't need to like find a smoking gun in some like secret calendar meetings. It's like right out there in public. They said we don't want to pay our workers a minimum wage, and then the rule is revised to cut the workers' pay by $3 an hour. It's like, you know, I mean, this is just capitulation to corporate lobbying in plain sight. Councilmember Brewer, you want to just say a word of welcome?
Thank you, Mr. Controller. I'm Gail Brewer, City Council member, and I am here to be supportive of the law. That's what we're going to be focused on when we testify in a few minutes at the hearing. But I do want to comment because it is interesting, Controller Lander, because in addition to the fight about the pay, as the workers know, we're also having a city council fight that the apps would like to get rid of any kind of a way in which they calculate what is the maximum. So, and there's a lawsuit on the same topic. So the apps are pushing all fronts. They're doing lawsuits and they're doing lobbying. I want to say in terms of the Workers' Justice Project, having been, even before all this fight at Union Square and elsewhere, when different worker groups come together. This Workers' Justice Project is unique. It is transparent. It is fantastic. It's a great, great organizing group. So, and I don't say that about everybody. I want you to know that they listen to both sides. They understand that, you know, we've had many battery discussions that are not easy to have. And they have understood that there are two sides to every issue, but not when it comes to the apps. There we're all in agreement. So there's a fight going on about the city council. I do not support that bill that Mr. Holden has. But I will say that for anybody who thinks that whatever other group, and I didn't even know there was another group, it's not the real group. This is the real group. Thank you very much.
All right, you heard it from Gail Brewer, so you know it's true. We got to get to the hearing, which is starting now, so we're going to wrap up. But thank you very much, everybody, for coming out this morning to Los Deliveristas, to WJP, to 32B.